And again, please go on mute unless you're asking a question, and I will turn it over to you, Brian, to introduce yourself and start your presentation.
All right, I will do that just as soon as I got the screen control back. All right, looks like I've got the control. Hello, welcome to this year's Microsoft in Higher Education conference. Pleased to be the first peer presenter to welcome you guys. Should be a great conference this year. My name's Brian Arkills. I work at the University of Washington. If you'd like to follow along or jump ahead or whatever, click the links that you see. My deck is here. There are a few minor changes that I made to the deck this morning, which I will upload after my presentation is done, but they should not be of much significance. I'm happy my video camera is working this year with Teams, so you get to see me in addition to the slide deck. Let's go ahead and get this going in presentation mode. I work in our identity and access management business service at the UW in Central IT. I'm a tech lead in that team among several tech leads. I also do a lot of work in the Microsoft area and have been an MVP in the past. So let's get going. So the goals that I have for this session are basically two: share some IDP comparative analysis that we did, as well as share some constructive patterns for change in the education sector. Of note, we have not made any change. So to the title of this talk, we have not made any change here at the UW at this time. We're in the middle of talking about this. So that sort of constructive patterns of change is very relevant for us right now. And Phil Swansea has a talk on Wednesday. I think it's the opening session where they have at Penn State made that change. So you might want to attend that talk as well. Okay, let's overview what I'm going to cover in the deck. I'm going to talk about what prompted this analysis, give you some orientation to the UW, talk about consensus building, and then we'll dive into the technical bits, the analysis, and talk about some problems and solutions that we've identified, and then we'll talk about what's next, and then Q&A. All right, so let's talk about mean time to irrelevance, which is a term that Terry Gray here at the UW introduced me to a long time ago. And at the heart of this talk is the question: how long before Shibboleth is irrelevant? And I think that's a crystal ball sort of thing, where you're trying to guess the future. And I think that this idea, this concept of trying to figure out when a technology is going to be irrelevant is very relevant. It should be something that with every technology you're dependent on, you're thinking about, when is this going to be replaced? When is this not going to be relevant anymore? When is my BlackBerry not going to be useful? Doing that, you need good perspective. You need an understanding of what the value is that's being provided by that technology. And you also need to understand what the alternatives out there that might make that technology irrelevant. Shibboleth has a very high usage in the higher ed community, but it's almost non-existent in other sectors. So why is that? Has the education sector lost its perspective, or is there some unique value that Shibboleth provides? So let's look at the Shib value proposition. It's very focused on the SAML protocol. I know that they just added support for OIDC, but have no plans to add OAuth 2 support. So when SAML's dead, Shib is pretty much not useful anymore. Shib also provides a very strong privacy foundation, which the higher education sector values. You heard Heather talk about that in the prior talk with reference to verifiable credentials, where what was it that what was the term that Pamela used? I forget what it was, where you could selectively release claims that might be in the verifiable credential that you've been issued. When that sort of future arrives, then this strong privacy foundation that Hyatt values about Shib can be gotten a different way. And then SAML federations are another unique value proposition that Shib supports. And SAML federations allow you to have sort of a external user trust, not have to do that for each IDP you want to trust. And it also provides a basis, a foundation for having these use profiles. A good example would be the research and scholarship claims bundle. However, there are arguably better ways to do this sort of thing. So this sort of value and the first and the third bullet points here, those ones are on shaky ground. So the forecast is not looking really good based on the strength of the value proposition that Shib provides. Let's look and see what other people have said. So a couple notable identity analysts here to start with. Craig Burton back in 2012 said SAML's dead. What he meant by that was nobody's investing in SAML in terms of a future technology. He's been made fun of quite a bit, tongue in cheek, I think, because clearly SAML isn't dead, even 9 years later. But the point that he was trying to make still holds true. And even last year, Ian Glazer was talking about, well, SAML is really dead in the sense that 10 years from now, it's just going to be a SAML zombie herd that's still around. So, if you look at why they've said these things, and in fact, I went back and listened to a talk Craig and Pamela actually had back in 2012 about this. What they really meant was, the authorization that people need to make in this federated world needs to be automated. There needs to be APIs in order to do that. And developers don't have that ability to do that authorization via API, via Shibboleth. And for that matter, most of the SAML products don't provide that. Likewise, they don't provide sort of SCIM, which is a provisioning protocol in order to provision users to applications. So SAML really just hasn't kept up. And most people, have poured that sort of investment into the OIDC and OAuth products. All right, let's move on a little bit. So some history here, what prompted this. PubCookie had a really long run here at the UW, arguably a little bit too long. Shib was introduced, midway through that and really took over. We just didn't push PubCookie down for way too long. Google and Azure AD arrived. We got ADFS in here. We actually unfederated Azure AD earlier this year, a couple of months ago. So Shib is no longer involved in our Azure AD tokens. We had a primary engineer and a tech lead related to our Shib offering, both retire in the last couple months. And then a couple months ago, I asked at our IAM team meeting, hey, how do we have a constructive dialogue about what our technology is here? And that came out of a little bit of frustration because for many years, I've sort of brought up inquiries about that, but never gotten anywhere. And so the answer I got from our team was, hey, let's have this analysis paper and form consensus. So that's what we've gone about doing. Let's move on. So Shibboleth is our preferred identity provider. What I mean by that is if you have some application to integrate here at the University of Washington, you're gonna get a recommendation to integrate it with Shib. The only time you're not going to get that recommendation is if you have some compelling need where that Shib doesn't meet. And so, there's a variety of things that are like that. If you need OAuth, you're not going to get it from Shib, so you would be pointed somewhere else. If you need WS-Fed, you're not going to get it from Shib, you're going to be pointed somewhere else. We are planning to retire our ADFS implementation in a couple months. And I do want to point out this this brick, which is a framing mechanism, a technology framing mechanism, to show sort of where in a life cycle a technology is. We got this idea from the NIH. You can follow this link to get to it. Very useful for representing where something is and communicating that and starting conversations. Twofactor here at the UW, we are using Duo today. Before that, we had Entrust and RSA Secure ID. We are also using Azure MFA, but only in a tactical sense. So those Azure AD only users, or those for those scenarios where some other tenant is requiring Azure MFA, then of course our users have to enroll. All right, let's talk about consensus building. So how higher ed IT works. And this is, most of you already know all this, most of the audience. So if you're not in higher ed, this might be useful for you if you're from Microsoft or somewhere else. But, I think this is a useful assumption that you need to understand. In higher ed, you've got central IT, you've got distributed IT units, many of them. You've got this idea that faculty have academic freedom, and so they can do and choose whatever they want. You've got individuals interacting with the university in multiple roles. And this all adds up to what I call, my Dungeons and Dragons reference here, chaotic neutral environment. It can be very confusing for someone who has not worked in higher education to move into higher education IT for these reasons, these sort of drivers. And just a real, let's look at a concrete example. So print nightmare, which we've all now lived through. In a corporate environment, there'd be a single person who would have the authority to say, yeah, turn off the print spooler across all of our workstations. In a higher education environment, there is not that one person who can do that. Each department has to make that sort of risk management decision and decide to do that. Central IT might have an advising role if the departmental IT departments trust them and have sort of set up that sort of communication channel. But a problem like print nightmare is a nightmare in the higher ed space. And of course, not all universities are the same. Some of them have other things that are complexity multipliers. They might have multiple campuses. They might have a lot of research. They might have a hospital system. They might have federally protected research. All of these things make the environment even more complicated. So major IT decisions really require consensus building, because when you go to change an infrastructure element, it requires that consensus be built. So there is a link here that has a longer summary to the higher education IT environment, which many of us in the high ed environment here drafted a long time ago. James Morris and I updated it a couple years ago to make it a little bit more relevant. I would love to continue to sort of improve that document over time. So how does consensus building work? First of all, this isn't an easy thing to do. There's no, step-by-step recipe online. And really, you have to go into it expecting that this is how decisions, major IT decisions, are made at an educational institution. Big piece of advice is to get things in a written form. That helps people have something to reference. It also helps capture history, and you can bring people into that as your consensus circle grows. I'd recommend you have someone who's a document facilitator, who just resolves comments, is authoritative for the structure of the document, and that kind of stuff. You're going to need somebody in IT who's a champion for whatever it is that you're trying to reach consensus on. And depending on how problematic that topic is within your IT organization, you may also need customer champions in order to push it forward. And I'll just say, our central AD, that didn't happen without customer champions. So there's a lot of examples of things here at the UW which required customer champions, and that sometimes is an important ingredient in the recipe to building a consensus. Within the document itself, you want to make sure your assumptions, the capabilities, the costs, and whether or not there's alignment with your strategies and principles. So these are all sort of things that'll help you towards building consensus if you're interested in doing that at an educational institution. So along the way, the road can get very jammed and ugly. So if you encounter that sort of gridlock, here's a few tips. Biggest tip is to listen. Sit down with the people who are in agreement, and just listen. You need to really focus on understanding what their point of view is. And I think what you'll find is that people are afraid of the change, and the reason they're afraid is that they don't understand the change and what it means. So those are almost always the top things that are contributing factors. But it may be that they've got a great point of view that you haven't considered. And so that may lead to insights that you can change the proposal and improve your consensus. Another thing is sometimes it isn't the right time for an idea. I tried to propose an inactive user policy many years ago and did not get consensus. And I had to back away from it. And then a couple of years ago, I reproposed it with a new idea and got that consensus. So sometimes you just have to wait. And sometimes what you think is a brilliant idea may not be that brilliant. So sometimes you just got to accept that things aren't the time, or it isn't a good idea. Finally, depending on the circumstances, it might be time for you to take your idea to that central IT figure and present it, even if you haven't reached consensus. And that can lead to sort of strategically important defeats, where that central IT authority figure actually understands what the factors are and what they should watch for in the future. All right, let's move on out of the consensus building section of my talk. So with analysis, there are a couple traps, and they're sort of represented here by the pictures. One of the traps is comparing apples to oranges. That is, you're not comparing the same thing. And that is a very difficult thing with pretty much every analysis that you'll ever do. And so you have to sort of accept that you can't get it perfect. You can't compare exactly apples to apples, but you can try hard to make it fair. The other trap is not realizing that different people won't see things the same way as you see things. And so that's where bringing in other perspectives and getting consensus about your analysis is very important. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the background assumptions going into this. In terms of market analysis, there's a lot of Gartner papers out there. Here's a couple that really support the idea that the market expects this continuous adaptive risk and trust assessment, CARTA, capabilities and online fraud detection capabilities. These are strong expectations. You heard it in Pamela and Pamela's talk before this. They talked a lot about sort of this attack surface and governance and security mechanisms and the signals that are coming in to inform your IDP and the decisions it's making. So CARTA and OFD capabilities are very important. So let's talk a little bit about what those are. CARTA is really the idea that that you can read signals, you can get signals at the time of authentication and make decisions about whether or not authentication is allowed or not at the time of authentication. OFD is sort of an after the fact, so that's sort of a real-time sort of capability. OFD is an after the fact sort of capability where you get signals and you realize that a credential has been compromised after the fact, or that it's at risk, and you might want to take, implement additional requirements for future authentications, or you might want to put that user under some sort of review process. So these are the sort of capabilities that these two talk about. You can see links to the Gartner papers that talk about those. In addition, we did some research on what other products provide, what others are doing in this space, and then sign-in volume, our existing sign-in volume. And so I've got a couple charts here. I focused on a single month for us, July this year. And as you can see, our Azure AD actually has about 3 times the volume of our YouTube Shib, which was, I think, a surprise for almost everyone who's seen these. Also part of the market background, Azure AD is the leader both in authentication and access control. Gartner and IDC MarketScape have published both of those. Here are the graphics associated with both of those, the IDC one here on the left, and the Gartner one here on the right. So then we took a look at all the other commercial IDPs and sort of charted those out against sort of some very basic capabilities that IDPs can provide. And as you can see, pretty much every commercial IDP has more capabilities than Shibboleth does. The lone exception here is this multilateral federation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it is of note that no commercial IDP has wanted to try to support that and supports it today. All right, now let's look at what others are doing. So I compiled this list myself. It took a long time to put this together. The first row there is R1 or R1 or equivalent universities that are using a commercial IDP as their primary IDP. And you can see that there's links where I have them to sort of proof that this is the case. So these first 2 columns really are about where you're only included in here if it's your primary IDP. And you can see there's a couple here that I've listed that are in progress, that have stated that they're in progress publicly. Then this last column, the Service Identity Bridge, we'll talk a little bit more about them later, but these aren't necessarily the primary IDP. Cirrus is not their primary IDP. I included this because it's relevant as a potential solution, and I wanted to include that sort of data for folks' reference. I think it's notable that Educause uses Azure AD as its primary IDP. So I just want to point that out. All right, so let's dive into sort of the nuts and bolts here. Protocol support. Both Shibboleth and Azure AD support both SAML and OIDC, and then we sort of start to get divergence after that. OAuth 2 is supported by Azure AD. Azure AD supports SCIM. SCIM is a way to provision. It's a protocol that allows you to provision user identities to applications in a standards-based way. It's been around for a very long time. I think 2012 or 13, I think it was. Shibboleth has no signs of adding support for it. WS-Fed Azure AD supports. Shibboleth had a custom module that supported it with much earlier versions, but it's no longer supported. WebAuthn, you can get third-party support on Shib, but Azure AD supports it natively, and of course Azure AD supports verifiable credentials. Presumably Shib might add support for that, but I haven't seen it or heard anything about that. Oh, and let me go back. Let me talk about the scorecard here down in the bottom right. So our analysis paper, which I'm not going to show you because it's 25 pages long and I haven't we haven't reached consensus on it yet, uses this sort of idea of the scorecard with thumbs up. And so for protocol support, we've got about 4 thumbs that we've given here because of the broad set of protocols that Azure AD supports versus the 1 that we've given to Shib. So it's just sort of a summary, quick summary of how are they scoring on a given category. Reliability. So here we're not talking about all Shibs and all Azure ADs. We're talking about just the UW instances of those. Over the past 3 years, we've had 3 major incidents for both. So that's kind of a wash. Azure AD supports cell-based architecture. This is one of the few minor changes I made to the deck. You won't see in the deck that you can download right now, but will be present there in a minute, with a link to an explanation of what cell-based architecture is. It's basically a small unit of deployment or configuration which can't be deployed without each other, that has some functional contract. And so usually a cell-based architecture can be replaced entirely in an automated fashion. So Azure AD has that. Shibboleth does not have that, although I do note that Shibboleth does have container support. Redundant backup authentication infrastructure, but to my knowledge, UW has not deployed this yet. So even with the container thing, it's a no here at the UW. Redundant backup authentication infrastructure, both have that today. And then the staggered change deployment with automated verification testing, our UW Shibboleth does not have that, but Azure AD does have that. You can kind of derive that Azure AD has both of these from reading sort of the after action reports on the most recent Azure AD incidents. All right, so let's move on to application support. So applications are really where IDPs shine. This is, you have an IDP because you have some application that you want users to sign into. So there's really a couple levels of applications. One is sort of the basic application, federated application that just needs a default set of claims. And, from a self-fulfillment provisioning perspective, any UW Azure AD user can do that for Azure AD. If you're a DNS contact for the application, then you can do that with yourself for UW Shib via custom portal that we've created. Likewise, there's for federation enablement, you do need to talk to UW IT so that you can get into the in-common or edugain metadata. This reflects sort of the different way that external federations are supported versus how Azure AD does it, where basically any user can do that, can enable something for multiple external domains. You can add additional claims as long as you're the application owner in Azure AD. For UW Shib, you've got to talk with UW IT to do that. One downside to Azure AD is that in order to require two-factor on your application, you've got to talk to us, and that's because conditional access for a given application is not a delegatable sort of thing. You've got to talk to central IT. Whereas with UW Shib, that's part of your service provider or relying party configuration that you can specify on your own. These are sort of the Cardiff capabilities. The only ones that UW Shib supports are IP and group-based limitations. Oops, clicked. Installation templates. So this is the idea that that there's a sort of walkthrough for a given application to get themselves integrated. Azure AD has way more than 1,000 of those. UW Shibboleth has none. UW Shibboleth does not provide access to sign-in logs for given applications. So I'm an application contact and I want to see how sign-ins are doing to my application. I can't see that with UW Shib. I can see that with Azure AD. Likewise, I can set up provisioning. This is that SCIM-based provisioning I was talking about before. I can do that with Azure AD. I can't do that with Shib. So application support, 3 thumbs up here for Azure AD, only a single one for Shib. So that's a big win there for Azure AD. External identity support. Let's talk about that a little bit more. So I talked about the sort of multilateral federation early on in this talk. Here's where we're going to talk more about it. So this is the way that Shib does, allows you to get access to another federation, another domain, without having to do a lot of work, without having to reach out. I don't have to reach out and talk to Wazoo to federate with them. I just federate within Common as a SAML federation, and Wazoo has federated with in Common, and via that we get multilateral federation. And there's this, at the heart of this, there's this MDQ protocol, which was implemented after the fact because they did not anticipate the size of the federation metadata file. So that's what that line is about. That is one way to approach federation and this problem of keeping the amount of effort to add another given domain, another organization's IDP, and trust to it. The approach that Azure AD uses is this idea of external users, and external users is arguably better because it allows you to have a central access control policy, because the external user is actually instantiated in a place where you can apply access controls and track it. With Shibboleth and multilateral federation, if the user is not instantiated, there's no central access policy I can implement to prevent joe at wazoo.edu from accessing anything at UW, or forcing joe at wazoo.edu to do two-factor to get anything at UW. There's no way to do that with Shib. Next line, how many IDPs, organizational IDPs, do you get via these two approaches? Well, at best, you can get 5,000 organizational IDPs via Shibboleth, via Edugain, which is the largest federation out there. With Azure AD, you get 200,000. Big difference there. Shibboleth does not provide social IDP support. You've got to get a third-party gateway to get that support. Azure AD supports that out of the box. 2 thumbs up here to 1 to Shib. Arguably, maybe 2.5, but that might be a little controversial. And I will note that I think a lot of people in the education sector think external identity support is a strength for Shib, when the reality is that it isn't. Carta. I'm not going to talk a lot about the stuff here because it's pretty much no on the left and yes on the right. And that is why you got the 4 to 1. You can review this at your leisure. The big takeaway here is that if you want the security protections, which are arguably two of the four forces that Pamela and Heather talked about, Shib is not going to cut it. Okay, let's move on to another important quality which we talk about in our analysis paper, which is the ability to customize and control your IDP. Yes, Shibboleth has a lot of ability to customize the look and feel. However, the counter really is customization really what you want? Because customization is really only needed if the product doesn't meet your needs. And I'm hoping somebody can mute the people who have their microphones going. Thank you. The other thing about customization, which really is not desirable, is that every time you customize a product, you actually have a bunch of impacts, which include increased security risks, potential for reliability risks, and costs of maintaining those customizations over time. So the ability to customize is not necessarily a thing that you want. It is something you want when the product doesn't meet your needs. It's also noteworthy that Azure AD B2C has a ton of customization capabilities for those apps that have special needs. And then let's talk a little bit about control. So, you know, I early on, I heard a lot about in our consensus building, well, we'd be turning over control of the IDP to a vendor, and what happens if the vendor makes a change and we don't like it? And I think, you know, one thing that one response I had to that was, well, what's our exit strategy for existing IDP? Do we have one? And you know, there's silence in response to that. And I think, you know, one of the things I saw on a mailing list around this topic was other universities claiming that open source products are actually harder to get off of and switch from. I don't know that that's true or false, but I found it an interesting comment. So, you know, the bottom line here on the control thing is that you really need to have an exit strategy for infrastructure that's so necessary and relied on, and it doesn't matter what it is. And I think that it's sort of a fallacy to think that an open source controlled thing is necessarily a lower risk than a vendor maintained product. So that's sort of the bottom line on those two. I'm sure that in your institution, if you have these sort of conversations, there will be lots of friction around these two. Now, I created this graph, so there's you can blame me for it, but this graph really is to illustrate, I think, a common truth about technology evolution. So, you know, technology goes through this life cycle where it's created and then it's sort of a custom built thing, and then it evolves into a product, and then eventually at some point it's just a commodity that you take for granted. You know, electricity would be a good example of that. You don't think about electricity very often. You just take advantage of those plugs in the wall. And so as technologies sort of go through this life cycle evolution, the value that they provide and the control that you have over them changes. So, you know, when it's a custom built thing, you have a lot of control. That's just the nature of where the technology is in its life cycle. But the value that it provides is a lot less. And so, you know, I think this is something that you just have to think about as a technology evolves. You need to rethink how you approach it and what your expectations are. All right, costs. Again, this is specific to the UW. I'm sure your costs are different. These are all estimates. We do not track these costs. This is all sort of us having to figure things out after the fact and trying to put this together. All of these costs are rounded to the nearest $10,000. Those are all my disclaimers on this slide. Let's look at these different costs. We spend about $10,000 a year on UW Shibboleth in terms of hosting the IDPs. We spend nothing on Azure AD in terms of hosting. Licensing costs, there's zero for either. There was a little bit of disgruntlement in our consensus building around the zero for Azure AD, but the reality is that we would have the licenses we have today, regardless of whether or not Azure AD was our preferred IDP or not. So that's why that's zero. Code development and maintenance, we spend, we believe, about $90,000 on Shib to maintain it and release, maintain releases, update our code for new releases, and so forth. We don't spend anything on that for Azure AD. App migration, so this again is existing costs. We believe that to assist people to do app integrations, we spend about $70,000 a year, which is 25 apps a year that we integrate to Shib on average. Azure AD, the number is 10,000 a year, and we do about 8 of those a year in terms of assisted integration. You might notice that the ratio here is not the same. That's because based on our calculations, it takes us half the time to do an Azure AD app integration as it takes to do a Shib integration. And then finally, our two-factor costs. And this is an interesting line and might be a little bit controversial, but it is a big number. So let's talk about it. So as you saw earlier in the presentation, Duo is our preferred two-factor solution. We spend somewhere around $170,000 on that. We spend nothing on Azure MFA today, which would be the Azure AD preferred two-factor solution. We are using Duo with Azure AD today via the third-party custom control conditional access capability. And if we switch to just having Azure AD, we could drop Duo and not have that $100,000 being paid out. So that's our existing costs. I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. So potential problems. There's the RNS category I talked about before. It requires a couple of things that Azure AD can't provide today. There's getting access to relying parties, service providers that are in SAML federations. There's specific to the UW, there's this inactive user policy that could become a problem for us. And then there's identity data privacy. And really, this is the one I think I want to underscore. Because Azure AD doesn't have sufficient controls on the data that it stores in the directory. And so that means that any app that you want to integrate that has sensitive data claims, you really can't use Azure. You can't really use Azure AD as the integration solution for it. I think this is the most notable problem among these. So solutions, you can keep Shibboleth around. That way, you've got access to those relying parties that are in common or what have you. You could use the SAML proxy feature, which is native to Shibboleth, to point to Azure AD as the authentication for your Shib implementation. That way, users have a common experience in terms of authentication. You could swap in Cirrus Identity Bridge for your Shibboleth IDP. It supports multilateral federation, custom IDP metadata, a lot of other features. And this is just sort of a one-for-one swap. The actual Shibboleth relying parties don't have to do anything if you do it right. And so, you just continue with those Shib relying parties, and now they are actually behind the scenes pointed at the Cirrus identity bridge. You can also just outsource your Shibboleth to this overt software company, which is what one university did over in England. So let's talk about transitions. It's a little bit nerve-wracking. So there's really three options that we've been talking about. This sort of slow cutover scenario where over time we move our existing relying parties over to Azure AD, and there's some benefits to that. There's this, let's just get rid of the Shib IDP, which really is the Cirrus identity bridge option. And then there's this sort of coexistence where you keep both of them for some period of time, longer than the short term, but Azure AD is preferred. So the slow cutover, there's lots of different details here. The nice thing here is that you're spreading out the impact, so folks can migrate over time. The downside is you're not getting rid of sort of some of the bigger costs up front. You got to wait a little bit. And another issue is that any apps with privacy claims don't really have a solution. Again, I'm going to point to the privacy claims for this eliminate Shib IDP one. There's lots of benefits in terms of costs and shutting things down, but there's not really a solution for this bottom one. And then the coexistence one really probably makes the most sense today until Azure AD has support for the privacy claims, whether or not that's via the verifiable credentials or some other feature. And there's various reasons why you might pick this, but you're not getting rid of a ton of costs by picking this. I do want to spend just half a minute on token lifetimes. I think it's notable that most of the on-prem IDPs like CAS and Shib have default token lifetimes that are very short compared to the commercial IDPs. All of the commercial IDPs have token lifetimes that are 30 days or longer. If you take nothing else from this talk, that's something that you should think about. All right, so what's next here at the UW? We're still forming consensus, as I mentioned. Our IAM and security teams are sort of our consensus circle for the moment. At some point, we'll send this along to our chief technical officer, our deputy CIO, and our CISO for their input and review. And at some point, I will publish that analysis paper, provided we come to some consensus. And I'm hoping there will be a future project for us. So I think I covered the two goals. And I do want to remind folks that Phil has a talk on Wednesday that goes into the implementation. So now we're to the question part.
Yeah, sure. Hey, Brian, I'll read some of them off to you.
Yeah.
So Christopher Clayton asks, what do you mean by self-fulfillment? You let users create an enterprise application in Azure AD?
Yeah, so I think the line that you're talking about was on this slide, and it was around those sort of basic applications. So any user at our institution can create a basic application with the basic set of claims in it and consent, basic consent. If they need something more than that, then they do need to come to us. And so that would be the enterprise application in Azure AD. They would have to come through us, yes.
The next one is more of a statement. It's from Alex Barth. Data privacy is still our biggest roadblock.
Yep.
And then Stephen I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. We'll just say Stephen K because I'll butcher it. Is Duo used for MFA for login situations outside of federated SSO? If not, maybe you can use Azure AD as a claims provider to Shibboleth and get MFA that way.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting solution for the two-factor aspect.
Yeah, we've, from the Microsoft side, we've had some customers actually flip the bid, if you will, and start using Azure Active Directory as the SAML provider, and Shibboleth becomes a SAML consumer.
Yeah, yeah. So that's taking it. It's taking it sort of the native SAML proxy thing that I talked about as a potential solution one step further, and that the issue there though is that you don't have per relying party capabilities because the Azure MFA is triggered from conditional access at Azure AD. It's not true. You can't trigger it from Shib. The Duo variation on that is an interesting one, and that I potentially would be possible. So yeah, that's interesting. But it doesn't really get you out of paying for Duo.
Randy Weimer, he states the B2C service can protect data used in claims in ways corporate side of Azure AD cannot. That was just a statement.
That's a good point.
And then Christopher Clayton, question regarding course security groups. Is that because of FERPA? I'm wondering about SDS creating group teams for schools and how it might be different.
Yeah, so Azure AD doesn't have read controls around most objects. The only read controls it has are for external users, where external users can only see basically their own object. They can't see other objects. So today, that's pretty much the only read control that Azure AD has. So once you stick a group in Azure AD, well, okay, that's not, I lie. I overlooked one. Office 365 groups also have a member private capability. So those are the two read control capabilities that Azure AD provides today. The downside to the Office 365 group capability is that Office 365 groups can only be used for a subset of use cases. And so, yes, you could stick course groups in as Office 365 groups, but that will only satisfy a subset of your use cases.
And one thing I do want to add about that is when SDS creates a classroom team, the privacy is actually set to hidden membership by default. So it's not a private or a public group, but it actually has its special designation from a class perspective. And where can we access the recording of the session? It will be posted on a YouTube channel afterwards. And Caden put a link in there for the forms, and Christopher Clayton followed up, says, thanks for the clarification. SDS is making Office 365 that are teams based, and we can always talk about that later. And then Randy Weimer said, there are ways to wire IDP like Shib ping to Azure using more than one app registration, and then use different CA policies in Azure to control whether MFA is enforced.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, Randy's point about Azure AD B2C supporting privacy claims from other providers is a really important one that I hadn't considered. So I really appreciate that comment because that'll probably make it into our analysis paper and help us. One thing that I would love for the folks who attended this is if you, if you think that you should be on this table, send me a note because I would love to keep this up to date and add others onto it. So if you're already using Azure AD as your preferred IDP or Okta, Send me a note. If you've got some sort of project in progress, let me know and I'll add you.
And Corey Lee did mention that the Sirius Bridge can apply a per app CA conditional access. This allows for selective MFA enforcement and device-based conditional access as well. And on that note, if there's no other questions or if anybody wants to come off mute, we'll give you one last moment to do that. And if not, we will release everybody to go have some lunch, snack, take a break, take a stretch. Right. And I will